Here we're going to briefly look at the career of Martin Scorsese and do a compare and contrast very quickly between Goodfellas and Casino. Now, I'm against the grain on the consensus with Scorsese, where people just consider him one of the greatest filmmakers, an incredible auteur, etc., etc. I do agree he's a good director, and I do think he can legitimately be called auteur. I do think the auteur label fits Scorsese, but I think his work is very, very mixed. Sometimes it's very good, but sometimes it's very, very poor. And I'm against the consensus on Goodfellas. I do think it has a lot of interesting elements, which I'll talk about in due time. However, I just don't consider it as powerful as many people do. So I think Goodfellas is more of an interesting effort, but not a very good movie. But Casino, interestingly, I do think actually is much more powerful and very underrated, and actually has a lot of elements that make up for what he did with Goodfellas. Because with Goodfellas, he was basically looking at these working class people and trying to give a sort of mythical documentary on how the mob works throughout the 60s up until the early 80s. And insofar as he does that, I think he does a pretty good job. I think we do get into the Henry Hill POV, but he distorts the history radically. That's just not how Henry Hill actually worked. He makes it seem as if he was in there for his whole life. He wasn't. Henry tried to get out of the life, but then he was drawn back in. So it's not very trustworthy as history, but even as a fantasy, I think it had a lot of problems. Even though he's claimed it's trying to de-romanticize the mob, I don't think he really went all the way. I think there was still too much romanticism of the 1960s in the gang life. However, with Casino, I think we finally have the real deal where he's much more critical and he's much more interesting, not just with the mob, but his own style. Because I think a major issue with Scorsese is just all style and no substance. He just throws too many things on screen. He just uses up way too many techniques. And to me, there's just a lot of hype, but there's very little substance into his stuff. But Casino, I think, is very well modulated. There's enough elements of both angles of Scorsese using all these techniques, whether the long shot, the freeze frame, voiceover, etc., to tell the story. It's also much more of an epic. Whereas Goodfellas is basically about 2 decades. This goes all the way. This goes from the 60s to the late 80s. Essentially the whole period of the mob being in Las Vegas. They were in Vegas in the 20s and 30s and 40s, but I think in terms of their height of power, this is where he's looking at things. He's looking at this trio of characters played by Pesci, De Niro, and Sharon Stone. And I think Sharon Stone does not get enough credit. She really anchors a lot of the film. There's also some great work by minor characters by James Woods. He really comes in and does a lot of stuff. So the minor characters as well as the more major characters really provide a really good portrayal of the mob sort of in decline as these people can't control themselves and they just self-destruct. So broadly speaking, it is like Goodfellas, but I think there are small differences that matter because with Goodfellas, he basically worked from a finished book, but with Pileggi, with Casino, he was able to catch him while he was finishing the book up. And as small as that is, that really, really matters because I think he had a much better insight into what Pileggi was up to and I think what the mob life is up to. And therefore, he's able to do a much more genuine documentary feel. So we do see a lot of the, quote, trappings of the mob life in terms of why people will be attracted. But we see much more thoroughly. It's filled with a lot of evil, ugly, questionable characters, and there's really no ethical norms behind it. We also do see them victimized in certain ways because they're mostly Italian. Although the main character is not. It's a really interesting play. But he does show how there's a lot of racism against anybody but white Protestant Christians. And so now the mobsters themselves, of course, are very racist themselves. So I think the commentary on racial politics of whites sort of attacking each other and being paranoid of one another and being paranoid of non-whites is very well done. Whereas Goodfellas, I don't think was ever stable or coherent on that question. It sort of went back and forth in terms of like, well, how racist is the mob? It does seem to be dedicated to this kind of pure blood ideology, but he never really sustains that theme. Here, however, we show in sharp relief how much the mobsters are sort of considered outsiders, not because they're criminals, but just because they're not considered truly white and they're not really, quote unquote, part of the culture of Las Vegas. And so I think there's a lot of interesting commentaries on the politics of race that he tried to do with Goodfellas, but I don't think he succeeded very well. So it works at various levels. Even if you don't care about the glamour stuff or him playing Gimme Shelter again or things like that, those more superficial elements, I do think there's enough here with the performances as well as how he maintains and constrains himself that I think makes Casino much more better and much more worth going back to than Goodfellas by far. So it's a very interesting piece, very mixed. I'll admit there are still elements where, especially with the soundtrack, he goes a little too far. But I think relative to Goodfellas, I think it's much more constrained. And I think the choices with the music are actually very, very interesting. And if you hear the background music I'm using in this very video, yeah, he really uses it to good effect. It does go overboard a few places, especially with the Rolling Stones. That's a major problem with him. He just loves playing the Rolling Stones, whether it makes sense or not, but fine to have those stylistic ticks. I don't think here, as with Goodfellas or other movies, he goes overboard. I think, for the most part, it makes sense. Like, the logic of these characters makes sense, and it's much more believable portrayal of Americana and American culture during this time period. And it sort of weirdly ends with Donald Trump, because at the very end he sees that the corporations and Wall Street have taken over Las Vegas. Again, Trump himself never appears, but you can honestly say there's a kind of interesting, neat little subtext about how basically it went from mobster capitalism to sort of KKK capitalism. So it's very interesting and very funny. I don't want to underrate the humor either. There's a lot of great funny jokes spread throughout. He uses a lot of great comedic talent, who I'm skipping over, but they do a fantastic job as well. Again, this is not for everybody. I think even for Scorsese fans, they were kind of mixed on this, but I think they should push aside their doubts. Casino is the real deal. He finally fulfilled the promise of really giving a very sharp portrayal of gang life in American culture. All right, this has been Auteur Analyzed on Martin Scorsese's tackling of mob culture in Las Vegas in Casino. Highly recommended. I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10. Thank you for listening.